bestaan zoveel meer stemmen dan het normaal dat wij gewend zijn.
En dus wil ik vragen om solidariteit. Bevecht alle vormen van racisme.
You have to say no to racism.
Want discriminatie raakt iedereen.
Wij zijn mensen van vlees en bloed. Wij zijn meer dan wat jij denkt te zien.
Racisme gaat ons allemaal aan.
En het besef dat we het niet alleen doen, maar we doen het samen.
Welkom bij Antisemitisme, uitgepakt. Dit is een programma met meerdere Engelse sprekers, dus daarom schakel ik nu over naar het Engels. And in English we say the unraveling of antisemitism. This program is a co-production of OIV, an open, inclusive and unapologetically Jewish community, and Pakhuis de Zwijger in de Samen tegen Racisme, Together Against Racism Alliance. My name is Meert Vreese and I'm honored to be your moderator this evening. So anti-Semitism is on the rise again. Not that it was ever gone, but in the last years it has become more open and blatant. Politicians, influencers, celebrities are openly spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, leading to a growing sense of unsafety within the Jewish community. Anti-Semitism can be blatant, but also subtle. It can manifest itself in direct violence, like, for example, the attacks on the Pittsburgh synagogue, but also in very small remarks. We call this microaggression, like, oh, I thought you were good with money, you know, since you're a Jew and all of that. So tonight we will discuss, you know, what is anti-Semitism actually, and is it helpful to have a clear-cut definition, or can this clear-cut definition sometimes also be counterproductive in order to tackle anti-Semitism? How do we recognize it? And of course, most importantly, how do you respond to it as a Jew, but also as a bystander, or as someone who is being accused of being anti-Semitic or making anti-Semitic remarks? So for the next hour, I will be joined by a group of different speakers, our academics, activists, community builders, artists. But we start with a short introduction by Ed Overdoner. He is the national coordinator on, I translated in challenging anti-Semitism?
Combating anti-Semitism.
Okay. Combating anti-Semitism. And he will tell us about the current situation in the Netherlands, and I hope maybe also a bit about what is being done more on a policy-making level in order to combat anti-Semitism. Ed Overdoner.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me tonight. I'll talk a little bit about the current state, but actually I also wanted to talk a little bit about the main topics that we're going to discuss tonight. But before I do that, I want to take you to some of the examples that cross my office and have crossed my office in the past years. For instance, a couple of days ago, when a boy that wanted to take a cab was just here from abroad, and he walked into the Rembrandt Square in the center of town, and he had a David Star of David around his neck, and he wanted to get a taxi to where he needed to go. But before he got to the end of the line, already 3 people accosted him and called him names, and it almost got into a physical altercation between him and a couple of taxi drivers, and he had to go away and walk home. Another example, just 2 weeks ago, a father goes with his son to Ajax to watch a soccer match. But he hears so many chants which are so despicable that he's ashamed towards his son that he's a fan of soccer. And he's thinking, I can't take my son there anymore because, you know, how can I show him the love of the game when they're screaming these things about my people? And a third example, maybe you've read it in the papers, for instance, is what happened in Brunsum, where a kid with a yarmulke, with a keppel, he went to school, and he was attacked there by people, and by not the first time, many times already. And now the father raised alarm, and he went to the national newspaper, and now everybody says we have to do something about it. But this problem was there already for a long time. To me, that type of anti-Semitism is the worst. It's not Of course, we have the big incidents and the things that come on television and we're all angry about and everybody says something about it. That's very good. We need to call out anti-Semitism wherever we see it. But the most dangerous anti-Semitism is the anti-Semitism we don't see at schools, at working places, where people are afraid to really just say that they're Jewish or to show signs that might give away that they are Jewish just because they'll have a harder time just having friends in a classroom or making a career. This very subtle anti-Semitism, often veiled in jokes and other remarks, that is actually the worst kind, and that's something that we must fight against. Now, questions that we are going to ask tonight is, what is anti-Semitism? One of the questions that we're going to answer. And I know there's very good panelists, but I'll say a couple of things about it. Anti-Semitism is coming from different areas. Could be from the left, extreme right. It could be from a religious source. And it could also be just tales about Jews, which are transferred from generation to generation, which really just exist in certain societies. And it morphs itself to crisis that you see in society. It could be a sickness, a virus that comes, the plague in the Middle Ages or COVID just recently. It could be a financial crisis. It could be a political crisis, like the revolution in Russia in the 1970, 1980, or right now, the war with Russia and Ukraine. Anti-Semitism always morphs and forms itself to the crisis at hand. And that in itself makes it difficult to recognize. And the problem is, because it's difficult to recognize, people often oversee it. Whereas Jews often say, hey, this is anti-Semitic. Others will say, you're really exaggerating. But they recognize the anti-Semitic tale that is underneath the remark about money or about power or about those other tropes which are so terribly damaging to them. But not only to them, also to democracy. Because democracy in itself is based on equal rights. Because how are you going to have an independent vote and one person, one vote, if this person is not free to express himself or herself? If you're not free, then you cannot freely make up your mind. Then you have to be scared to be who you are. And then you cannot also be free to vote, because your vote might be challenged by somebody who says, but no, you are a Jew, or you only vote for your own motivations, and then you'll maybe vote differently. Or just retreat from politics as a whole because you're Jewish. Democracy is based on equality. It's based on the right to be yourself. And therefore, anti-Semitism is a danger to democracy. Now, how do you recognize anti-Semitism? That's very difficult. I explained already that the different forms, they change all the time and they adapt to the crisis that you see. But one thing you shouldn't do is just not look at it. You should focus and you should stay on top of it and see when it changes towards a new challenge and come ahead of it. When we see a crisis looming, like for instance the COVID crisis, we already had to be at the beginning wary of what's going to happen and make sure that we target disinformation, that we get a clear-cut campaign that at the moment somebody tries to target or scapegoat a group like the Jewish people for some crisis in society, that we have an answer as a society. And we must make sure that the government does not stand on the sidelines at that point. Because I believe that anti-Semitism, if only addressed by the Jewish people, will prevail. It is the task of society as a whole to protect all the minorities, but also to protect the democracy itself on which society is based, on which Europe is based, on which all our social contracts are based. So anti-Semitism, often referred to as the canary in a coal mine, is really the first sign that something is wrong with your democracy. So what do we do? What do we have to do? We have to stop ignoring it. We have to stay focused in our efforts to battle it. We have to take a role as a government, step forward, be norm setting. And we have to call out those who abuse and undercut the battle against anti-Semitism for their own political means. Very often, a good example is of course also the Ukraine-Russian war. You see that anti-Semitism in one way or the other is used for political means. One says, I'm doing this war because the other side is anti-Semitism. The other side is saying, no, you are actually the one who is reminding us of anti-Semitism. And both sides are really framing this war, which has nothing to do with the Russian-Ukrainian war. It's about territory and power and all kinds of things. And are framing it towards a question about anti-Semitism. And that's not the first time. We see it in many conflicts in the world. And we have to really call it out immediately when it happens. As a government, and then now I'll come to your question, I'm sorry. We have little time. But as a government, what we do, first of all, there is a plan sent to Parliament in October last year on the areas that the government wants to cover and the role it sees for itself. You have to understand that anti-Semitism is not something that can be solved by the Jewish community or just the government. It's something that we, or at least I feel from the government side, is something we do together with partners in society, together with the schools, with the societal institutions, with the NGOs, and with all the good-willing people in our country. So this plan really talks about engaging them, talks about monitoring and follow-up. So how do you see what's happening both online and offline? How do you then focus on where that is happening? And then how do you adapt policies to address that? It's about penal code, about law, changing the law in such a way that you can really bring the government into the 21st century when it comes to online anti-Semitism, because we really do not yet have an answer to that. It's grown so fast, all the platforms, all the social media, but our law system hasn't grown with it. We just simply don't have the capacity to prosecute every single aspect of anti-Semitism online, so we have to look at different ways. The second part is about education, about prevention, looking in the sports arenas, looking at the soccer stadiums. How do we focus on who is starting those chants? How do we then get to them? And how do we think of a way to change their minds? Because these people will come back to the stadium. So just a fine will not stop them. Can we bring them to a place where they learn about Jewishness? Can we bring it to a place local to that club? So don't bring them to another city, but see how Jewish history in their own city, the city where the soccer club is based, has thrived. And the third part is remembrance and celebration. So prevention and education, the second one. Third one, remembrance and celebration. And remembrance is very important because the central narrative, one of the foundations that our the European Union, our country, after war was built on, is really also what happened in the Holocaust. We all said, this must never happen again. And one of the reasons why the European Union was founded is to make interdependencies between the states also an economic space, so that a war does not have the fertile earth to put its roots in. Therefore, we must remember that war, and we must retell that story to explain to everybody why it's important that we keep the rule of law alive, that we work with our neighbors instead of against our neighbors, because this is what can happen, and not only to minorities, but to the whole of Europe. So remembrance is key in the fight against anti-Semitism, but also celebration, and that's my last point. You cannot only fight anti-Semitism with repression. You cannot say, you must not do that. I know what you think about the Jews, but you must not do that. No. You have to explain what are Jews. Who are they? There are, of course, too little Jews in the Netherlands to all have the Jews themselves explain it to everybody. So it must also be part of the normal education in the school that you learn about Judaism, that you learn about anti-Semitism, and how normal it is in the Netherlands to be Jewish, that the Jewish citizens have been part of this country ever since it has been created, and are not some foreign body that is among the Dutch people. And in order to do that, we have to explain about Jewish culture and just make it very normal that somebody knows about Christmas, somebody knows about the Ramadan, and somebody knows about Yom Kippur. Those things should be on top of the mind of everybody. And then when they see how normal it is and how equal it is to their own culture, it is much more difficult to hate. I wish you a very good conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edo Verdonner. You pinpointed out a lot of subjects that we will definitely discuss also more in depth. So now I will introduce my next three guests. And when I introduce you, please come forward. Judith Frischmann, she is an emeritus professor Jewish studies at Leiden University Center for the Study of Religion. And from 1997 1979 to 2019. She was also professor of rabbinic Judaism at the theological faculty of Tilburg University. And in her research, she has focused on the effects of the Enlightenment on Jewish identity, the problematic Jewish-Christian relationship, and the parallels with the present debates concerning Islam and integration of Muslims in Western Europe. Welcome, Judith. Then Jessica Reutemann, she's a professor of Jewish studies at the Free University of Amsterdam. She's an historian whose work engages with colonialism, religion, and ethnicity. And her focus has been on Jewish communities in colonial spaces, with a particular emphasis on the Dutch Caribbean from the 1700s to the 1900s. And she's interested in the boundaries between groups and in processes of minorization and belonging. Welcome, Jessica. And last but not least, Jonathan Listic. He's a lecturer at Leiden University, teaching courses on decolonial theory and critical political theory. And he's interested in the connections between Jewish philosophy, decolonial theory, and aesthetics. Welcome, Jonathan. Okay. So, to begin with, it was already talk what is anti-Semitism? Judith, to start with you.
Well, I would begin with a simple definition.
Yeah.
And I would say that anti-Semitism is Jew hatred.
Jew hatred.
Yes.
Period. Jessica, would you agree? Would you want to add something?
I would agree. I would say it's a negative perception of Jews and a negative perception based on their Jewishness rather than individual behavior, or ascribing traits of individuals as being derived from their Jewishness or from their group membership, but also vice versa.
Yes. Yeah. And then Jonathan?
I would add to that exactly that answer very Jewishly a question with a question would be that it depends on what we define as Jewish, and by that question itself sometimes implies in an anti-Semitic. So some things that came up before, depending on how we define Judaism, very often we also define a complicated portrayal of Jews and Jewishness. So those two.
So in order to understand what anti-Semitism is, you should first understand what Judaism is.
And how we asking that question already implies very often a tone of anti-Semitism. The desire perhaps to define Judaism is already an anti-Semitic desire to put them in a frame.
Well, I think a lot of people who are anti-Semitic, perhaps they don't even know any Jews. They just have a construction of who or what a Jew is. So it's the question, who's supposed to be defining it?
And do you agree that wanting to define what Judaism is can already be a sign or can already be an example of anti-Semitism? Jessica?
I don't know. I would have to think about that more. I mean, I think...
Can you maybe, Jonathan, elaborate on it? Because I think it's a quite thought-provoking thing you've said. Can you give an example on one time you encountered this kind of debate on what defines a Jew and you thought like, ooh, this is...
I think depending on how the question is framed, we already have a question of anti-Semitism. For example, the question would be, why are we trying to define, for example, because by trying to define, we portray it, for example, as an alien object, something strange that needs inquire, that needs a curiosity. And therefore, by sparking a curiosity, we already frame it as something that is other than us, other than our society, and other than our common life. And therefore, even if we have a harmless definition, to some extent, we already presuppose. So for me, for example, a lot of the times, we find people who would obviously not be anti-Semitic and not see themselves as anti-Semitic, but they hold on to stereotypes that they see very often as positive or non-harming, but that come from an anti-Semitic place that already establishes their Jewish peers, or even people who they never met, but have that might fall into the category as something alien to them, and therefore
But isn't it important to? It's the same with also racism when it comes to people with people of color. When people say like, yeah, well, I'm colorblind, so I can't be a racist. So isn't it important to also define what are Jews and what is anti-Semitism, because otherwise you can also never pinpoint out what is that something is anti-Semitic, Judith.
But I think that it's only up to Jews to define who they are themselves, not other people to define who they are. So perhaps this is the confusion in the discussion here. It's whether you are allowed to decide yourself who you are, or that other people are telling you what you are, who you are, and what you are, and what the implications of that are. I think that's what we're on this line, right?
No, I would totally agree with that.
Yes. So. In the battle against anti-Semitism, sometimes, very clear-cut definitions are used. You have you have different definitions. And they are much broader than the definition you gave. Do you think it's important to have these definitions?
I'm not sure I understand your question. So, I mean, when I said anti-Semitism is Jew hatred, I think it's a very broad definition. Right? Because I'm trying to avoid all these intricacies, because there are many types and sources of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and there are people who also connect anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and I'm trying to keep it as basic as possible and as broad as possible, so that we can have a shared definition to talk about something.
Yeah, clear. Yeah. So I started my talk with saying, anti-Semitism is on the rise again. Do you agree with my remark, Jessica?
I do. I mean, I think anti-Semitism has always been with us, unfortunately, and as we've already discussed, I think it becomes very hard to get at the numbers and what's being reported, what's not being reported. I think even more important is to look at, okay, we're seeing this rise, or this reported rise in incidents. Where are they coming from? And why are Jews feeling unsafe? Because it does seem to be that Jews in the Netherlands, but the United States, elsewhere, are feeling ever more unsafe.
Yeah.
For good reason.
Can you, do you have explanations for the rise, Judith, of anti-Semitism?
Well, I think actually we're seeing a worldwide increase of populism, and populism almost always goes hand in hand with prejudice, including racism and anti-Semitism. So I'm not surprised, but what I really find very shocking is not so much that there is anti-Semitism, because there always indeed is anti-Semitism, but that it's become salonfähig. It's become acceptable to use anti-Semitic, to express yourself in anti-Semitic ways. It's become acceptable in politics for people to make remarks, and that there are not many people who will say, well, this is not okay, this is not acceptable.
Can you give examples of these remarks?
Well, I think that that if we look at the party of Baudet, unfortunately, I mean, he's made a fool of himself, but more worrying is not so much he now, but his followers, his young followers, young people who have adopted anti-Semitic ideas about the Jews and their role in the world and their role in controlling many things.
Yeah,
I think that the fact that this is fairly widespread among many young people, I think this is very worrying.
And do you, Jonathan, also think when, for example, I mean, I don't want to give the guy too much attention, but on the other hand, we have to, because I think he's one of the most, blatant anti-Semitics with the most, power right now in the Dutch political scene. But do you think that, when he talks, he has, you call this tribes, right? When he talks about this, I don't know, monsters and as, do you think that also youngsters really, see like, he means the Jews, do they see it as something that has to do with Jews and anti-Semitism?
I think if they don't, that would be even more worrying, because if the structure is there and he doesn't even need to name the Jews, but he sets the discourse just to put the cherry on the cake, where he becomes anti-Semitic, it's even more problematic than if he was, to some extent, saying explicitly, where we can confront him directly. For me, things like, again, not that I disagree with what was said before, but elements of what we call today philo-Semitism, people who portray themselves as defending or standing on behalf of Jews, but are in fact setting structures that are anti-Semitic, are more dangerous. So people who talk on behalf.
We will go further on that because I know you. I know you have a lot of ideas about this, but I think it was because I just want to make it more simple. That I've said to people like, "Oh," and then Baudet is saying all these things, and they're like, "Yeah, but he didn't say Jews, right?" And then you're almost seen as paranoid.
Yeah.
But his followers do understand it because they have picked it up, and they are blatantly anti-Semitic. They don't hesitate to mention Jews by name. So if you think he's very subtle, he knows how to play the game, but his followers are not so subtle. So they get the message.
But do you think that also people who are not followers of that kind of parties also should see what he's actually mean, you know, to understand that there is, because otherwise maybe they don't see the anti-Semitism that is, you know, here in society. That's actually what I mean. Like for some people this is not so obvious that this is anti-Semitism.
But I think they're using coded language that, whether they're aware of it or not, does allow it to become entrenched. So when you're talking about globalism, globalist, cosmopolitans, rootless people, some of these conspiracy theories, whether or not you're actually mentioning Jews, whether the people who are parroting these remarks or retweeting or whatever are actually themselves referring to Jews, it's falling into fertile soil, and it's allowing then these tropes to continue.
Yeah.
But I would like to say something about other politicians.
Yeah.
I mean, Wilders is less popular than he was now at the moment, but for some reason there are Jews who think that he's a friend of the Jews.
Yeah. But
really, I mean, he's towards the left on several issues. But just because he defends Israel doesn't make him a friend of Jews. He has no empathy at all with Jews. He had lived in Israel and he has this idea about Israel. But when it comes to Jews, he's not on the same page. So I think perhaps this is even more dangerous, that people think he's our friend. He's not our friend. And I mean, I think he's definitely a racist. And I think it's very important to realize as Jews that when someone is a racist and against one group, we know where it's going to go next.
Yeah.
Right? And I think this is a very important fact, because I think it's not only that we should think for ourselves. We have to be careful because look, he's against Muslims, but we have to show more solidarity with other groups who are experiencing racism.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point, and I think we will also go in that a little bit further in the evening. Edo also pointed out, I mean, there are anti-Semitism is coming from different groups and different directions. It has different starting points, you know, religious, racial, nationalistic. Do they also manifest in different ways, is my question. And my second question then is, does it matter that that you know where, from what source it comes? I'm not going to say names all the time. Just feel free to, you know.
Well, if you don't mind, okay. So I've been working many years in the field of Jewish-Christian relations, and I think that Christian anti-Judaism, that here in the Netherlands, but also outside of the Netherlands, there's been a lot of work talking to people involved in the church about how the church stands towards the Jews. Are the Jews people who crucified Christ? Are they the people who are no longer chosen and have been replaced by the Christians? Or is there some way that new theology can develop so that there's a place for Jews within Christian theology, so you can be different without being dismissed, right? Without being seen as evil or rejected. And I think there's been a lot of positive work, and this required a very specific approach. Talking to Christians about anti-Judaism is not the same as talking to left-wing anti-Semites. It requires knowledge, it requires theological knowledge, and it requires a different approach on different levels. So I think, yes, we have to address problems in different ways, and you have to have people who are knowledgeable in different areas to deal with the different problems.
Yeah, clear. Jonathan, you also see a lot of the times that Judaism and Christianity are kind of, seen or used by politicians as the same, like, oh, we have this Christian Jewish traditions, we are a country, blah, blah, blah. I wrote somewhere that you also find this very problematic, and that this also has a sense of anti-Semitism within. Can you elaborate on that?
I think I think the concept itself historically is an anti-Semitic concept. I think people who have studied the idea of Judeo-Christianity have homogeneously or unanimously pointed out its anti-Semitic history. But I think if I talk about the usage today, comes exactly from this place of that worries me, of philo-Semitism, of saying we learned our lesson, we no longer hate Jews, now Jews are part of our project, our common values, but as long as they join the project. And this is worrying in two trends for me. One, because it conditions Jewishness to this role of being loyal, so Jews have to be loyal to this project, or else they are not truly Jews. And we have examples of politicians claiming that Jews who vote for the other party are not true Jews or are not loyal Jews. And this affects Judaism despite presenting themselves. And more importantly, or equally important, it allows for Judaism to be weaponized against the supposed new enemies of this civilization. So now that the Jews are in, there is the new enemy who's threatening the borders, and Jews have to be loyal and helpful towards them. And this is a position that we shouldn't take, because one, as I mentioned, the whole project was built on discrimination against us. So it's a trap in two ways, in my view.
Yeah, and it's really to what Jonathan said. It's really meant to exclude Muslims, and that's what we need to be careful of. Like, oh, we're being pulled in, and now this is our new internal enemy, which Judith's also written about, which are Muslims.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but I want to add something even additionally. When the European Union wanted to have a constitution, and they wanted to include Jewish, Christian as the basis of the European Union, and yes, this was definitely meant to exclude others, but I was against it. People said to me, why aren't you pleased about it? Because it's recognition. And I said, well, it's not really recognition, because it's based on two things. First, it's the idea that Jews and Christians share something, and what is that? It's the Bible. The Jews made a big contribution to society, and that is they gave the Old Testament to society, and the Christians have continued it, and we are a Christian society. So that's the first thing. But it is not a recognition of the fact that Jews have lived in Europe for 1,000, 2,000 years, and that they are the part of the people living in Europe who formed Europe as it has become today. So there's no acknowledgement that the Jews have been part of Europe, and Europe is what it is because also of the Jews living there. And I don't like when we talk about the Jewish contribution to society, because there's not a society of which the Jews are outside and they therefore contributed something. No, they're part of society, and society is formed because of their presence and the presence of other peoples. So if you want to talk about Jewish Christian, some kind of Jewish Christian basis of society, but you're only talking about the Bible, but not about living Jews and about their lives in Europe. This is sort of a philo-Semitism that's at the same time a real denial of real Jews.
Maybe just good for the audience, what is philo-Semitism?
Is this idea the opposition to anti-Semitism, this idea that we are obviously not haters of Jews, we love the Jews. Yeah. We admire the Jews. The Jews are the best. So philo comes from love.
Okay, yeah. And do you think that the Jewish community has been vocal enough then in the last years to address this thing, like we are not part of this Christian Jewish tradition and culture? Because I think you're very clear about it, but it's not that I've seen this on, all the time within newspapers written about.
I think it has, but it's not interesting to have that focus. So I think very often the people who oppose this project have been vocal, but the narrative doesn't include those people because it's uninteresting. I'll give you an example. So in Brazil, Bolsonaro went to the Jewish club to make a very racist comment. And the fact that he was received was taken to be an approval of his philo-Semitism, that he was not, in fact, anti-Semitic. And that became the narrative. But there was more people outside protesting his coming in and his association with the Jewish community than inside. But nevertheless, the story becomes that he's a representative of Jewish Christianity, and he was well received by Jews everywhere. So I think there has been a lot of resistance to that, but it doesn't receive the focus because it's not what we expected to be focusing on. It's more interesting to tell the other side.
Yeah, I have to wrap up this round. Yeah, time goes very quickly. I'm trying to wrap it up in my head, all the interesting things that you have been saying, and that is that I think we should keep the definition of what is anti-Semitism very short, you know, and very clear. That what is a Jew should be defined by Jews themselves. And that anti-Semitism comes in many forms, but you really have to be careful of the forms that maybe look on first hand least dangerous. And I think this will come also. The Jewish community has become more vocal on all these kinds of issues, and also become more vocal when it comes to the whole issue of discrimination and racism, so that they are not, that being a Jew is not used as a weapon to hit other minorities. I hope I summed it up with. Thank you so much for your contribution, Judith Frischmann, Jessica Reutmann, and Jonathan Listig. So we now go to a very special guest that is coming through us online, and that is the causes and the reasons for anti-Semitism, or why a lot of people find it complicated to be an ally against anti-Semitism, is, I think, the big pink elephant in the room, and that is Israel. And therefore we have invited Hadar Cohen. She's a Jewish anti-Zionist activist who writes and talks a lot about anti-Semitism and Palestinian liberation. Welcome, Hadar.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to hear all of the beautiful insights discussed in the panel. And yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about exactly what you named. And first, I want to just start off by saying that anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and all forms of racism are connected with each other. And particularly, I think that there's very deep connections between anti-Semitism, Orientalism, and Islamophobia, and particularly in the European landscape. So, thinking of when the Jews first came to Europe, part of the reason why they were discriminated against so much in Europe is because they were actually very Oriental. They were practicing these pre-Christian traditions and rituals that to the newly formed Christian empire was seen as barbaric, as outdated, right? Jews didn't accept Jesus. So they had this, a lot of the original anti-Semitism was actually structured through this form of Orientalism. Obviously, through the development of the years, Orientalism has expanded, and Jews, right? Jews have also been living all over, because not all Jews went to Europe, right? There's Jews who were in the Middle East also for thousands of years. But I think that structure is really important to talk about and to understand, because I think that part of what is happening in the European climate, at least, is that how anti-Semitism is really being weaponized, and a lot of it is being projected onto Muslims, onto Arabs, and particularly to Palestinians as well, which is coming from this way that, people have this misconception that part of supporting the Jewish community means supporting Israel. So I want to unpack a little bit about that, because I think that actually not only ends up harming Palestinians, but also harming Jewish people, and that there is a very deep need for particularly Jewish-Palestinian solidarity, particularly in Europe. So first, part of the creation of the State of Israel was actually as this answer to the Jewish problem in Europe, right? Coming from the aftermath of World War II, there was an interest in getting rid of the Jewish communities all over Europe, right? The European countries did not want their Jewish communities there. And Israel, served as a way to really get rid of the Jewish problem there. And I think it's really important to talk about that because sometimes, there's this interest, and I really appreciated that conversation about philo-Semitism because I think it's really important that, the reason why Britain was invested in creating Israel and later the US, it wasn't because of safety for the Jewish people, but it was actually grounded in a very deep and ancient form of anti-Semitism of trying to get rid of the Jewish community. So when we're trying to fight anti-Semitism by supporting Israel, part of what we're saying is that Jews actually don't belong. Jews don't belong in Europe. They don't belong in, whatever countries they were coming from, and that they should all go and move to this place that is, disconnected and isolated from the rest of the communities and the community structures that they were part of. And I think that that is really misleading a lot of people, because I think the way to fight anti-Semitism is actually to fight for Jewish belonging wherever there are Jewish communities, wherever there are local Jewish communities. And I think in Europe, there still needs to be a very deep reckoning of the history of anti-Semitism. And, sometimes when people say, is anti-Semitism on the rise, in some ways, of course it is, but it never went away because we never actually had that reckoning, right? I think that the support for Israel is a way to put a Band-Aid, especially for a lot of kind of white Christian anti-Semites, right? They're like, okay, well, we support Israel, so we've done our deeds, and, whatever guilt or shame we feel towards the Jewish community, we'll just say that we support Israel, and that's how we're exonerated from actually looking at the history of anti-Semitism and the presence of anti-Semitism in our local communities. So I think that the way that we talk about support for Israel actually very much harms safety of Jewish people and Jewish communities. And I also want to say that, it is really upsetting as a Jewish person to see a lot of this, because part of what support for Israel means, it means upholding a military occupation against Palestinians. And, Palestinians have been systemically oppressed for 74 plus years, right? And I think that safety of one group can never come at the expense of another. And I think that part of what we're seeing is that the structures of racism, as I said in the beginning, of the way that anti-Semitism and Orientalism were so linked, now we're seeing that the same thing, actually, right? That a lot of anti-Arab racism is being couched in this way that we are supporting Israel and somehow defending the Jewish community. But actually, it's the same system of oppression that's still functioning. It's still that same racism, because, we cannot continue to blame Arabs and to blame Muslims and to blame Palestinians for European anti-Semitism. And I think that there is a really strong need that we put, really watch very carefully for when that projection is happening, and actually think about, okay, but how do we bring that back? Who is actually responsible for that? How do we actually reckon and deal with anti-Semitism in where it originated from, which is in, Christian European colonial powers? And not to mention, one of the things that I really enjoyed in hearing in the panel before being spoken about is the way that, certain Jews, the reason why they are protected or they seem to be more safe is because they're closer to Christianity. The closer you are to Christianity, the more protected you are as a Jew in that class. So there's an interest, right, in bringing the Jewish community as close as possible to Christianity. And sometimes, right, obviously there's that history of forced conversions as well. But part of what that does is that it actually destroys the Jewish Muslim world. And we've obviously seen that in Europeans' colonial legacy throughout the Middle East, is that how there was a very strong interest to rip away the Jewish communities from their Muslim communities and to bring them closer to this Christian community. So those are just a little bit of what I wanted to share. I think these conversations are so important. And I think that, it's really going to be impossible to talk about fighting anti-Semitism without actually understanding what the reality is in Israel and the way that these conversations are being had. And I think that it is also very important to center and to understand Palestinian experience and to understand Palestinian oppression and the way that Israel has become this very violent apartheid regime that is actually not for safety of Palestinians or the Jewish people or anyone who is invested in justice.
Well, Thank you so much, Hadar, for this, and you will stay with us also for the Q&A. So I can imagine that people in the audience have a lot of questions for you, and you will stay with us. But thank you very much for now. Then I would like now to introduce my last two panelists. It's Liefnat Faber. She's a Jewish educator and activist, birth and death doula and ritualist. And she weaves Jewish activism, life cycle awareness, and ritual together to create a joyful and empowered Jewish life in Europe. Wow, this is such a mouthful. She's also the co-founder and program director of OIV. She's part of the faculty staff of Zalil Kollel, and she is also gonna study. Where was this? To become a rabbi, right? Yeah. So welcome, Liefnat, and then Jelle. My last guest, he's a Jewish queer activist, theater maker, and hobby cook, making very good hummus, I know. He's one of the co-founders of climate activist collective Queers for Climate and a founding member of OIV Act, a collective of Jewish progressives. And with OIV, he's currently co-leading the Jewish Manifesto project. It's a project aimed at giving a voice to the lived experience of Dutch Jews. Welcome. And I think that's also where I want to start this conversation with, because we also touched upon a little bit, who are Jews? And I think my question then is, do you think that the Jewish community is visible enough within Dutch society for people to have an understanding of, what is this Jewish community and what is a Jew? Yeah, you really...
What's a Jew?
Wow.
What's a Jew? I'm a Jew.
Or maybe if you find this a difficult question, I make it... is it in the importance or on the agenda of OIV to make the Jewish community and also like the Jewish joy more visible within the Netherlands?
I can start and then I'll pass it on to Jelle.
Yeah.
But I think that it's not up to a community to become more visible, although I do think that a lot of Jewish communities in the Netherlands still are fearful of, for good reason and for reasons of protecting their synagogues, that there is fear in opening up. So that's something that we see. I think that what we want to do with OIV and what I think is, for me and for other people, very healthy, is that you can express yourself as a Jew amongst many other elements of your identity. I'm also a woman, I'm a mother, whatever, all of these elements, and that you can do that in society as part and parcel, and that you don't have to hide being Jewish in one setting, and maybe, so you have maybe two cycles that you pedal between, you being Jewish in your community and you're being not Jewish outside of your community.
But do you think, Jelle, there is a connection between anti-Semitism and the visibility of the Jewish community?
It's an interesting question because not necessarily is the answer, I think, because we've seen in societies where Jews were extremely visible, anti-Semitism has thrived, and we're also seeing that anti-Semitism can thrive in societies or in places where Jews are not visible. I think what is important, that the image that people have of Jews is, how do you say it, supported by real life interactions and encounters. And in the Dutch society, to make it more specific, that is extremely hard because there aren't many Jews left, and also the Jews that are still present in Dutch society aren't very visible. So I do feel that, I think, to come back to maybe to Edo's point earlier, that to celebrate Jewish identity and to be visibly Jewish, and also not to make, in my ideal world, and I think that relates to something that Liefnat expressed as well, is that it's just something that is. So yeah.
And it is beyond the Holocaust, beyond dead Jews, beyond religion, and beyond Israel. And there is more. And these are the three maybe pillars that we
there is more, but do you think that for a lot of non-Jewish people, that is what they think of when they think of Jews?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. You have been very active in the anti-racist movement. I also spoke with Hadar a little bit already. We asked her to tell about this, but how is Israel a difficulty in finding allies, also in the support for the struggle against anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it is because exactly what Livnat said, that Jews are being reduced to these sort of abstractions. So knowledge of Jews is reduced to, okay, we see Jews killing Palestinians on television, we see Anne Frank, and we see soccer hooligans, and that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
So the frame of reference for people is, I've had it happen to me very often, that I come into a space, and it can be at a birthday party, it can be in a progressive activist space, it can be at my job, where people find out that I'm Jewish, or they see that I'm wearing some kind of Jewish symbol or whatever, and the first question that they ask you is, so Israel, what do you think? Mm-hmm. Which is, something that I can talk about and that I love to talk about, but it's not something that I'm willing, that my identity should be reduced to, or part of my identity.
Do you hear this from more Jewish friends, that they also always have to justify themselves about what their stands are on Israel?
Yes, and I think there's some Jews in the room, maybe a show of hands, like who's had this experience. Yeah, so most of them, I would say. Yeah, so it's there.
So I think I want to discuss this a little bit more, but we will do this when the camera goes out, and when we are still, live and online. I would like to discuss with you. Okay, so how can you be, a good ally of the Jewish community when you're not a Jew? In combating anti-Semitism, really a kind of hands-on manual. What should you do?
I want to start by just going back for a second to this definition question, because I think that this plays a role in how people can be allies or can't be allies, and I just want to unpack that, because I think that we often get stranded when you're in progressive spaces, and you're a Jew, then the question of Israel comes up, and maybe you're sidelined, and we don't seem to get past that moment and into a conversation on how can we be allies to others in their, fights against other forms of racism and discrimination, and how they can be it for us. The conversation sort of halts. And I think we need to understand that when we're talking about anti-Semitism, and I think also Edo also, brought this up, but I just want to bring it up in like a 3-step. Mm-hmm. We have it in the judicial, area, that we're talking about law, like what kind of definition do you give so you can make laws, so you can, prosecute. Yeah. You have the social, the social realm, and I think this is like the most important realm, because in the social realm is where everything happens, all these microaggressions, all these complex relationships, right? And in the social realm, it's also where the people, us, are suffering from anti-Semitism that we hear daily around us. And
can you give an example of something, that you hear daily that hurts you?
Okay, so maybe not daily, but a very small thing, because most of the things that happen in the social realm never make it to the judicial realm of talking about anti-Semitism and the definition of anti-Semitism. So, very short example, I'm in a cafe, and a guy stands up and dresses as a Nazi, in like a Nazi costume. He knows it's a Nazi costume because the costume package is on the table, and, I go to him, I talk to him, and they didn't say this, but it was Hitler's day of death, and they've been seen around Scheveningen, going to all these places that are very important in the Second World War. So we can very safely assume that this guy was had Nazi sympathies, etc. Tried to prosecute, failed. Yeah. So just saying that there's a lot of things that happen that have an impact. It had a huge impact on me to witness that, but it doesn't make it to the other level. Now there's a third level, and that's the political level. Okay, so a lot of the times, anti-Semitism, or the debate around anti-Semitism, is politicized, so used for a political purpose, which is other than protecting Jews or having a conversation about anti-Semitism. And the last thing that happens in this realm, where we see the effects of in the movement, is the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And that means that you use anti-Semitism or the concept to target another person or another group.
Yeah, that was also said in the first panel, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is very terrible because we want to be talking about tackling this problem of anti-Semitism and getting allies in the social realm. But every time you start talking about anti-Semitism, it's being sort of hijacked or pulled back into the political realm. And I'm not denying that this stuff goes on in the political realm and that we should talk about it and we should understand it. Also, us as Jews, we should have these conversations, not be so afraid to look at what's happening. But in terms of how do we get allyship, we need to talk about it internally, what's happening in the political realm, but also our friends and our sort of comrades or people in the progressive movements need to understand that we need to be in the social realm together.
My last question for you, Jelle, is like, have you addressed this with non-Jewish friends? Like, I really need you to back me up here, or or could you be more aware of what is happening and, stand up for me?
Yes, I have, and this can sometimes be difficult conversations, and that is actually one of the answers that I also would give to the previous question, like how can you be a good ally? And that is to allow for Jews to call anti-Semitism out and define it. And those can be hard conversations because people don't usually. It was talked about before. People tend to frame it as paranoia. And another thing that I would say people can do if they want to be better allies for Jews is to not automatically conflate Jews with Israel or hold them responsible. To educate yourself on anti-Semitism and on what it is, and also to don't expect Jews to somehow be your perfect victim, because what I feel often in this kind of discourses, and it can be on either side of the political spectrum or wherever, is that there is this perception of that there are somehow good Jews and bad Jews. But in the end, anti-Semitism is coming for all of the Jews, so that is a very problematic
Very clear. Yeah. Very clear. Thank you so much. We will continue our talk, a Q&A after this, but I have to close the program now for the television. So if you want to also see the Q&A, you can go to the YouTube channel of or the website of Pakhuis de Zwijger. So something to look forward to is that on the 21st of May, there will also be a Samen, Tegen, Racisme livecast, but then about the discrimination against the Roma and Sinti community. So the coalition Samen tegen Racisme encourage you to address racism and discrimination whenever you see or witness it. And then please contact Meldpunt Discriminatie Regio Amsterdam through their website, because then we can actually hold track on all kinds of racism and discrimination. And if you have a good idea about how to tackle racism and discrimination, you can apply for funding here at Pakhuis de Zwijger through their grassroots fund. And for more information, check out the websites. So thank you for watching. Yeah. Okay. So now we're just with us, Oh, am I now jabbering through the live, I guess? Okay. Okay. Yeah, so are there questions in the audience? You can also do it in Dutch if you don't want to do it in English. Just please raise your hand. Yeah.
I'm going to try to do it in English. Hi, I'm Yair. I came in later. I couldn't come, so I don't know what the first panel was about. But I have a question concerning calling a lot of things anti-Semitism. So it also becomes a kind of container begrip, how you would call it. So, for example, you can remember a couple of months ago those projections on the Anne Frank house. A lot of people called it anti-Semitic, and of course, there is something in it, but I don't know what is the advantage of calling it anti-Semitic, because it also becomes like the capital misdaad, capital crime, and I think it was more kind of stupid and of course also quite dangerous behavior. But there is also a thing in when we talk about anti-Semitism and we want to understand it, there's also a problem in calling everything that happens where Jews are related anti-Semitic. And I don't know if it helps.
Is this also a form of weaponizing anti-Semitism done in a different way, you think?
Yeah, probably, but that was maybe something you were talking about in the first.
Well, no, maybe someone wants to respond to this. Like, do we also sometimes call things anti-Semitic, which maybe aren't? But then we also come to the definition, of course. But yeah.
No, I'm interested in how you wouldn't call that anti-Semitism. I mean, if I'm understanding what was projected, it was basically denial of the Shoah. It's calling into question Anne Frank's diary by saying it was written in ballpoint and that wasn't invented, and calling that into question. So I'm interested in how that for you wouldn't fall, why you would be uncomfortable with calling that anti-Semitism, but maybe you all want to comment as well.
Well, the thing is then mostly what it is denying Holocaust. So then you have to call it Holocaust denial. And you know, that's a thing, because there's also in society, if we're talking about Samen, Tegen, Racisme, there are so many things in society that are racist and people are discriminated, and when something concerns Jews, there's everything is back to anti-Semitic. So also this, and I don't know if it is helpful.
I do think in this case it's very important to clarify that this specific conspiracy theory about Anne Frank and her diary being written in ballpoint, and so also a denial of the Holocaust, then leads back to, you know, a whole world of conspiracy theories where Jews are, you know, accused of making up the Holocaust for their own benefit. So yeah, then they got a lot of reparation money, and they got the State of Israel, and you know, all these things. So that is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I find it hard to name some specific. Well, I feel. One of the things that happens a lot is that, for instance, you see someone, some politician was present at a pro-Palestinian demonstration or something, and they are photographed standing next to someone who is holding a Palestinian flag or something, and then people say, "Ooh, look at her, that's an anti-Semite," and that's for me a very clear example of where it becomes where you should look at that a bit closer and be like, really, is it anti-Semitism, or is it someone standing at a certain rally for a specific cause, in this case, which is not necessarily anti-Semitic? It can maybe spill over into anti-Semitism in certain cases. So I do feel that sometimes we are confused, or we call it anti-Semitism a bit too easy or too soon. And that is, of course, dangerous because it trivializes anti-Semitism.
Does it then also hurt the Jewish community in the end?
In the end, trivialization hurts because then it becomes something that anything can be it.
I'd like to add something to this, because I think it's saying something is anti-Semitic. It's, again, we're using this word, but it's about how we then continue the conversation. And I think the art of any definition, so also to say, oh, this is anti-Semitic, so we're defining an act, right, is that we can create clarity, that we can add meaning and understanding, and allow for a critical discussion. So if you label it as anti-Semitic, then I would expect and I would hope that a conversation would ensue. And that's not always the case. So the problem I see in Dutch society is that, yes, we do say about many things that they are anti-Semitic, but we also about a lot of things we don't say. On a big news outlet just 2 days ago, somebody in the room made a complaint, thank you. There was a whole news item on how the conspiracy theories that are out and about in the Netherlands are raising the level of like the security alert for terrorism, right? No mention of the word antisemitism or Jews, although the entire page was filled with anti-Semitic tropes, so we're not mentioning it. So what's happening, I think, with this definition, when we define something as anti-Semitic here in the Netherlands, is that we actually do the opposite of what a good definition should do, because we are making it obscure, vague, or we're just not mentioning it. And we're confined.
What should a good definition do?
So it should create clarity.
Yeah.
Yeah, so not obscuring and making room for like wiggling. It should add meaning and understanding to the people, the public. So we need to understand why this is anti-Semitic. And if it's anti-Semitic, why is it harmful for the Jewish people? Not just that it's anti-Semitic and now we're not going to talk about it because you're an anti-Semite and that's done. Because it doesn't help us. Because whenever there's silence and polarization, I don't think it works.
This gentleman. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amir. Mag ik het vasthouden? I want to point several things, but to go to this one, I think it's a big problem in Holland, like the February
strike.
They made it for the whole world and for everything, and everything we are against, like should be in it, and I think they're forgetting the Jewish.
Or you mean the 4 May commemoration, or? Okay. Oh, they also do that there now. Oh.
So it's become like a global thing about everything in the world that is bad, and I think they're forgetting the source.
And where did you get this feeling? Because I just went to the February staking and I really didn't get this impression. So I'm just curious if we went to the same February staking. What? No, but I don't want to. But was it the speeches that were there, or what made you feel that it's just becoming very broad, vague, and not about the Jews?
Many years they decided to bring everything, all the wars, everything in the world, to it, and I think it connects to the. Not mention the Jewish.
That was in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
I've been there
a
lot of time.
Okay.
I've been working for the television in Holland. News for many years, so that's why.
But then maybe whether the February stacking has changed or not, maybe then we also should address your point that when we commemorate, in relation to anti-Semitism, as I understand you correctly, it's really important to really have the Jewish story as the central story. Am I saying that correctly? Okay, yeah. Yeah.
I heard a lot about the right politics.
Yeah.
Nobody mentioned anything about the left. And that's a big problem here in Holland, because they are really, it's problematic, maybe more than the far right.
Edo, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. I actually I did say also left, and I think it's important to say that. Just as it's important when we speak about religious, it's Christian and also Muslim anti-Semitism. We must name it, and if you name it, it doesn't mean that the whole that the crime lies with the whole group. That's exactly what anti-Semites do. They sometimes, if they see somebody doing something wrong, they then project it on the whole group. It's a form of anti-Semitism. The same goes when it's anti-Semitism coming from a certain group, but you should mention it. And if it comes from the left, it comes from the left. If it's related to Israel, it's related to Israel. You should identify it. You should call it.
Can you give recent examples of anti-Semitism coming from the left?
The most one of the most recent, or the let's say the most perpetuating idea is that Jews created capitalism. It's part of also in the Russian Revolution why Jews were blamed for this.
But do you also see this in Dutch left politics? In parties, in left-wing parties?
Left parties, You look at Marxism, for instance, but the point is that because it's Marx's name, that is,
No, but some Jews are Marxists, and other Jews are rightists.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the point is that anyways...
I'm very confused a bit. I don't know what I am.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I can understand. No, so the point is that if you look at political parties, there's not really, or some may say it, but in the extreme left parties right now, we don't have a very big. Some examples there, but you see it in extreme left movement.
Yeah, so then we're more talking about movements, right? Instead of political parties.
Yes.
Yeah, Jelle, you wanted to add something when this was addressed.
Yeah, because I think it's an interesting mechanism where I'm in conversations about anti-Semitism a lot, and every time I talk about it, either someone comes to me and says, "You didn't mention the left," or someone comes to me and says, "You didn't mention the right," and it's I don't feel it's that interesting. We can talk about it maybe later, but I think it can come from a lot of different sides, and it's all equally harmful and bad. What I would like to add, though, is that in my personal view, what I'm seeing in the Netherlands right now is that we have actual people in parliament that, I mean, Thierry Baudet is even tweeting about Jewish conspiracies running universities and journalism and finance, and it's out in the open, and it's someone that has actual political power, and that is for me really worrying. So I think maybe that's why it comes up more. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's cheap to me because it's a good.
Where's the mic? You have the mic, right? Yeah.
No, I have one for.
Yeah, this is for you.
Yeah. But could you give a mic here? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Ik kan hem vasthouden.
No, we don't allow that. Sorry.
I'm a sound guy, but okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice one. No, I think you were very specific about politics. So give me some other examples. That was my question. So that's why I think it's important.
I get it.
Hadar is also still online with us. Does somebody has a question for her?
Well, I have a question to the panel regarding the statement from Hadar.
Yeah, wait for the microphone, please. Then Hadar can also hear you.
Yeah, Hadar, thanks for your presentation. One part of your presentation triggered me, and that was your reference to the thought in Europe about the creation of the State of Israel, and that it was a kind of an excuse to get rid of the Jews. It is not something I recognize. I would say there was, first of all, already before the war, a strong wish for Jews in Europe to create a State of Israel. And second, for example, there are large groups of Christians who have a strong belief, and that is also triggered by what they read in their Bible, is that they should be strong supporters of the Jews and of the State of Israel. And that I think what we have experienced here in this country, that a lot of people from the Christian side very much support the Jews and also are still supporters of the State of Israel. So I was curious whether there are people in the panel here who could comment on your statement.
Clear. Yeah, Jessica.
I would just quickly say, and I think Judith can also comment, that the Jewish question emerges much earlier. It doesn't emerge after World War II. It emerges in the 19th century as a response to, well, and one thing, the growth of nationalism. So it's not just a post-World War II phenomena.
Yeah, about the Christians who support Israel. Well, there's an expression, there's een smaddertje onder het gras. And most of the Christian groups that support Israel believe that all Jews should come to Israel, and in the end there will be the judgment day, and the Jews who do not convert to Christianity or believe in Jesus will get their just punishment. So it's all sounds very nice that they support us, but you have to be careful of them. I avoid these people like the plague because I don't trust them. I really, this is philo-Semitism with a really ugly tail attached to it. You know?
Yeah, and many Christians who are great supporters of Judaism in the Netherlands and are great friends of Israel. What you're referring to is a minority, an existing minority.
Not. I think you make a mistake. It's not just Christians for Israel that have this idea. There are many Christian groups that support Israel that have this idea behind their friendship. I'm not saying that there are no Christians who are real friends of Jews or real friends of Israel. Yes, they exist. But you have to be very careful, and you have to look at their theology carefully.
I'm also curious
by the statement, and that just said, okay, Europe was really happy that the Jews went, and I think that is a challenging statement. And
then let's go to Hadar. Maybe she also wants to respond to that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, this is very important, and the person in the front, I don't know your name, who was talking about how the roots of Christian Zionism are actually very deeply anti-Semitic, and again, it's not, I think this is something that sometimes in the Jewish community we're misled about, and we really need to have like a very deep and open conversation about it, because sometimes people think like, oh, these people support Israel, therefore they support the Jewish people, but they're supporting Israel for their own political agenda and their own interests, and oftentimes that doesn't include the safety of the Jewish people. And I think, going back to what I was saying about the question of the Jews in Europe and how that actually ties right now also to what's happening in the US and US imperialism, Christian Zionism is the biggest like pro-Israel lobby here. And a lot of times people think that, it's because of the Jews, but it's not. It's because of fundamental evangelical Christians. Those are actually the main supporters of the state of Israel in the United States right now, statistically speaking. And there's a reason, like the presidents of the United States that are all, lined up with Christian beliefs, they're supporting Israel not because they care for the Jewish people. They're supporting Israel because it has a U.S. imperialistic agenda that helps them infiltrate to the Middle East. So this is a way that Jewish communities are actually being used, and we're not really fully awake to that because we are so strong on Zionism or support for Israel as this belief that that means safety for the Jews, but they're just using us to infiltrate into the Middle East and to perpetuate U.S. imperialism, which is actually very similar to, I would say, what happened in the beginning of the creation of the state, where European powers, and we can see that with French colonialism, with British colonialism, right? They were coming all over the Middle East. It wasn't just, right? There was an interest there in disrupting till this very day, and we see that there has been this destruction of the whole Middle East and the whole region. And I think that we need to start looking at what's happening in Israel-Palestine from that perspective, and not just from, what we were trained to believe, because I think that the Jewish community and Jewish people are often weaponized and often used for larger political systems. And I think that we need to start being really honest and understanding these larger systems of European colonialism and U.S. imperialism in particular, and they're not our safety. They're just not.
Jonathan, do you want to respond to that?
Okay, I'll try to be brief.
You don't have to. I thought because you had
No, I think I'm just thinking myself. So basically, I'm not going to get into the case, but for me, what it's just, if I can be as abstract as possible, would be the suspicion of.
Please be not.
The suspicion of where that love comes from, because very, very usually what we find is that it creates a dynamic where we love certain groups because they behave like we want them to behave, and then it creates the opposite side, that those who don't behave as we want to behave are either traitors or enemies and all sorts of bad things. I've seen it happen in a lot of places, and it creates this dynamic of that Yale mentioned of the good Jew, bad Jew, that is profoundly anti-Semitic, because that thing doesn't exist. So I don't want to get into the specific cases that you might think, but I'm always suspicious of people who come and say, we love Jews, we support Jews, we have your back. It always seems to me that it comes on this place of either conditioning, we love you as long as you behave and support us as well and serve the purpose that we're trying to navigate. And then the second you no longer do that, you become the enemy the ultimate evil. If I can give a completely different example, for example, when Bolsonaro received the head of the FNV, the German Nazi party in Brazil, the Jewish community was, why are you doing that? Those people have Beatrix, I forgot her last name, is a direct descendant of a Nazi leader, the one who replaced Hitler directly. Why are you receiving? And then the Jewish community was immediately treated as betraying a project that they were allies before, even by just asking the question. So it's very easy for that shift turn. So I'm always suspicious of that dynamic and what it creates.
Can I add like a really short comment?
Yeah.
Because maybe for the gentleman in the back, it could be a very interesting movie to watch. There is a good friend of mine, Abraham Truer. He made a beautiful documentary called Till Kingdom Come, and it shows really well how Christian and evangelical support for Israel is the biggest source of income actually for the country, and also, or not the biggest source of income, but of funding, you could say, and also the agenda that's behind it, and that is what was mentioned earlier, the kingdom to come, where Jews will either have to convert or be smitten by Jesus.
I have a question also for Hadar, and then I go to the gentleman, because when you are in in this kind of anti-racist, anti-discrimination movement as a Jew, and you try to make alliances with other minority groups, and then you encounter, anti-Semitism, which is, based on Israeli politics. What would your advice be for, these Jewish people in these communities to encounter those people that have, this anti-Semitic ideas, or maybe want to exclude you, while you have also the same struggle, against racism?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So again, I think like all forms of racism and anti-Semitism lines up with it as well. Usually it comes from one of two places, right? Either it really comes from deep hatred and deep ideology, or it comes from a place of ignorance, right? As some people said before, like some people just actually have never met Jews. And the reason why they have these beliefs is because they never had someone challenge them. So I think understanding, first of all, where is that anti-Semitism really rooted in? Is it very like a deep ideology hatred, or is it a ignorance, or where like misunderstanding, or not having enough information? Because that is sometimes really important to how we're going to respond to that anti-Semitism. We're going to respond to it differently. And I can share that what I have noticed in my own personal life, especially, I think there was sometimes this conversation with the right or the left, but I wanted to speak particularly about my experience with Arab Muslims, right? And sometimes when anti-Semitism comes from that perspective, a lot of the times what I have experienced personally is that it's actually not deeply rooted in the ideology. It's just how they grew up. And it's actually very easy to tear apart if you engage in relationships and communication and, share authentically and vulnerably the impact of what that means. And I've seen tremendous shifts in those communities, when I am able to say that. So I think one is, I think that there's a lot of ways in which anti-Semitism gets internalized into our communities, and then we don't speak up about it, and we don't have faith in relationships, and we don't think that things will shift. And I think that part of, fighting anti-Semitism is also relationship building with other communities, with sharing our stories, with sharing the impact of anti-Semitism. And a lot of my way of combating anti-Semitism is focusing on the latter, focusing on anti-Semitism that is actually rooted in ignorance and misunderstandings and misinformation, because that is so much easier to combat. If I am faced with something that is more serious, that is more deep ideology rooted in hatred, I wouldn't go about that one-on-one, because then my safety would be compromised. But I would actually, reach out to my own personal community, reach out to whatever initiatives that are going on to how to protect the Jewish community. But I think, learning to discern between those forms, I think is really important, because I think that you know, a lot of times I talk about relational segregation. I think that racism thrives over this divide and conquer and separating communities and making sure that they don't talk to each other. And that's how, you know, really toxic ideas about other groups come up. So when we break that, when we are like, no, actually, let's choose conversations, let's choose relationships, let's actually engage with what this means, and actually not just, you know, from this intellectual perspective of like, this is what anti-Semitism is, but like letting ourselves be felt, like this is what the impact of it is on me personally in my community. I think that is the way that I found that a lot of anti-Semitism can be disentangled almost like pretty instantaneously, right? Because people love relationships, they love stories, they love connection, and I think we need to lean into that more.
Thank you. Question from the...
I'm a peace professional. Sorry, actually, I may have dozed off a couple of times because for me this is a long day, but it's important for me to be here.
I'm sorry.
It's not that it's not an interesting topic, otherwise I wouldn't be here. I'm standing up against anyone who's violating the Geneva Conventions, like Morocco occupying the West Sahara. Anti-apartheid South Africa has been a part of my life, and I am now coming to the Spui every first Friday of the month with the women in black to protest against how the state of Israel is dealing with the Palestinians. So then there are some members of our community here in Amsterdam who are calling some of us self-hating Jews, and others like me, because I'm not a Jew, I'm called an Antisemite. And it doesn't feel right. Call me an anti-Zionist, because that's what I probably am. Mm-hmm. But how would you feel about sharing my feelings?
So if I don't think it's up to me to give my personal opinion, but I think that what you say is that anti-Semitism, it's also weaponized to, you know, to use to attack you. If maybe you wanna.
That's what happens, also, and I think it is a problem that we should be looking at together, and in a way that we keep as a goal or as an end in sight that we want to make the Netherlands safer for Jews and for other people of other minorities. And so this is a conversation at some point we need to have of how in the political realm anti-Semitism is weaponized against other minorities, because it happens and it's shitty. And so how do we deal with it? I think we need to start a conversation amongst ourselves and to be safe to have those conversations. If that's enough of an answer, but can I go back to the other point for 1 second?
Yep.
Because they're all very interesting points, but I think they're sort of in relation, because as much as I think we Jews on the progressive side need to feel safe enough to have conversations on how anti-Semitism is weaponized and to understand the sort of the dynamics of it and to speak out against it and to reframe or bring the discussion also back to the social realm and what we're dealing with, and so we can have that conversation, because it's very dangerous what is happening all around us, the blind spots, everything in the Netherlands as relating to anti-Semitism. But there's also work to be done for the people that we work with and we want to work with as allies on the other sides, and that is that there's a lot of gatekeeping going on.
What do you mean with gatekeeping?
With gatekeeping is, Hadar was speaking about human connections and human interactions, but you need to be able to come together first. And there is an issue of needing when you... Well, we talked about it in the beginning.
But have you experienced that the gates are being closed for you, or are you saying to yourself that we have to open, as the Jewish community should open the gates a little bit more?
Oh no, it's both. But now I'm talking about the others. So the question that came from this gentleman is, I'm protesting what is happening in Israel on the Dam, or no, Spui, you said, and the people from Jewish communities are calling me whatever, an anti-Semite. So this is the weaponization. Safe towards an activist. And I'm saying this is true and we should have a conversation. On the other hand, there's also conversations to be had within the political or the progressive sort of activist left movement, let's say the movement, and that is to try to dissolve the gates that are there. And to be more specific is for our allies to understand that being Jewish in the Netherlands, we have a long history, a very recent history of trauma, that when we have a lot of connections to Israel, and when we think of Israel as this place that we're safe, this is also the narrative that we have, right? And so we, the Jews, Jewish progressives, whatever, we're also unlearning sort of these structures. We're unlearning to believe only that Israel is our only safe place. We're also learning to want to be safe here. And so as we take these steps, we want to be in conversation with others. But if the gates are closed because somebody calls himself a Zionist, for example, then we cannot have these meaningful interactions.
And have you also experienced literally that the gate was closed, and what did you do then?
And you try to explain what's happening. So you try to say, I want to have a conversation beyond this point, and I think it's important that we have the conversation, and that we don't close the gates because you think something of me.
Yeah, clear.
I want to say some things to you. You said that you are probably, you're not anti-Semitic, but you're probably anti-Zionist. And I found it a little bit strange that you said probably, because the question is, you know, what are you exactly? And you, if you want to be an anti-Zionist, that's okay, but I think a lot of people will have problem with that. I have a problem with the idea that, I mean, where is the line, right? So if we talk about where Jews feel, what Jews feel okay about and what they don't feel okay about, I can speak for myself personally, and I think it's a little bit different than what you just said. I don't know why people would want to deny the right of the state of Israel to exist when they don't deny the right of any other countries to exist. So this is for me like the bottom line. Why does Israel not have the right to exist, but all other countries that violate human rights, we can criticize them, but we don't say, you know, Saudi Arabia doesn't have the right to exist, or China doesn't have the right to exist. They exist, and it's a fact, right? So if you say, what is it that I'm criticizing? I think it's really much more useful if you don't attach that label to yourself either. I don't consider you an anti-Semite, but maybe you should think about not attaching a label to yourself and thinking about having a conversation about what it is that's bothering you, yeah, and what could be done about it. Yeah, because it's not helpful to say, okay, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm probably an anti-Zionist. We can't get any further in the conversation with that.
I think you want to respond or not? Yeah.
I started clearly that I am opposing any system which is going against the Geneva Conventions and other parts of international law. I feel I'm a very Jew-loving person, as you inspired me to say. I'm also a chakra healer. And there was one lady who said, I'm half Jew, I don't feel safe in Amsterdam. And the second session of my course in chakra healing, she came to me, she said, my life is completely different. So she felt safe in Amsterdam again because of me opening her root chakra.
I don't really see the. Well, I think it's very.
It's not only Israel where you can feel safe. You can also feel safe in Amsterdam.
Yeah, but that is so personal, you know. But yeah. So that's great for this woman. Yeah. Here, the lady in pink.
Yeah, it's something that comes up in me lately more and more. That I realize how much. People around me, for instance, or in certain circles, or everywhere, or wherever. It's a bit fake what I say. There's a lot of empathy for everyone. If you come from a certain, you come from a country where there's oppression. We want to embrace you. We understand you need help and all this. And then I encounter also that for Jews or Israel, there's this it's not like that. It's even oh, you have a friend in Israel, or you have. It's always the question comes up, the political thing, and I feel it as if it's questioning being Jewish. Is it okay, or is it? I give an example. I was in an art environment, and there was an exhibition or some and a magazine about being stateless, and I missed for the beginning that there was a video connection with the Palestinian artist. So it's very good and interesting to exchange, and it was in Amsterdam. And I knew it was about being stateless. And then afterwards, I was talking with some people, and I said, and knowing I was going there, I was looking up how my mother came into Israel, Palestine in '39. Otherwise, she would have been killed from Vienna. And I found on the internet that there is a form of immigration from the English colonialists who were occupying Palestine, and that there was a form with her name and her mother's name, arrestation file from the police to be illegal immigration into Palestine in '39. So, and I was bringing this up just to with people, not to the Palestinian guy, but afterwards, and then even someone I know for many years said to me, and then you went to, how do you say, wegjagen, chase away the Arabs. And I was really shocked, like my mother, 13 years, so that it is something about empathy, like to know each other's stories and to know and to hear it and to have this known on this personal level. I think is very important to understand each other and to feel I'm not. It's not a victim story, all the Holocaust and that, but it's part of history.
Yes, thank you for your story. I think they're behind. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for everybody who spoke. I have a question for everybody who is an activist. Maybe there's more people who are an activist that didn't identify tonight as an activist, but I think that for, 15 years now, the language has changed. The language really has changed not only in politics, but also in different arenas in life. And people are using hyperbolics a lot more, generalizations, drogredenen.
But sorry, for me, because which language? The politicians,
no,
activists?
The language, I mean just the words that we use to form sentences include more saying everybody instead of nuancing who are you exactly talking about. So it's a generalization, and that goes into anti-Semitism, but that can also go into activism when you're trying to combat anti-Semitism. And what I'm trying to ask is, when you're trying to make a statement and you're trying to make a strong statement in the face of other people using a certain language that is looking for the extremes, looking to polarize, exaggerate, to create a lot of emotion, does it become difficult to stay true to nuance in your story when you're speaking? Because, to be honest, I also heard it tonight sometimes. I heard people, and actually not only people who identify as activists, but I heard emotion come in where like half of the sentence will be very much focused on facts, and when emotion comes in, it can go into what are drogredenen in English? Fallacies. Thank you.
But I'm listening to you quite, because I think this was a very nuanced talk. But so I'm very curious who you think was very extreme in the answers she gave.
No, that's not what I'm saying. This is the general question is about other places than tonight.
Yeah,
I've heard some examples tonight, which is great compared to what I usually hear everywhere since 15 years it's been growing and growing and growing. But my question is, when you're in a situation where that kind of extreme language is used a lot, which, by the way, now a lot of people don't consider this extreme anymore because it's been normalized. But actually, if a normal political conversation, if we would have listened to that 15 years ago, we would probably be shocked. So that's my question. How do you? Are there ways to check yourself, or when you're faced so much with people, and then, I mean, we're social animals, right?
Well, maybe.
I don't know.
I really don't understand the question. Could you? Oh.
Yeah, I hope I can clarify it, because I understand a little bit what you're meaning. I think it starts. This conversation started with the definition of anti-Semitism. And I think there are a lot of nuances in whether something is antisemitism. I think that's also something where we shouldn't be black and white totally, because you have anti-Semitism, you have stereotyping with hatred, you have stereotyping without hatred, you have Jew hatred. And I do think that you really have to make a distinction among people if they're saying something which someone might, if you define that as anti-Semitism, that for the person who might say it, it's just a stereotype, and he doesn't even mean by it. So I do think that the nuance is necessary also in the definition. The other thing, but I do think where the nuance is necessary, is this whole concept of philosemitism.
Philosemitism.
Yeah. So I think that we really, this problem of Jew hatred should be resolved not only by Jews themselves, but also by non-Jews. And if you really are so strict against people who are fond of Jews or in favor of Jews, and you all consider them in a sort of conspiracy theory to be have certain meaning which they don't have, I think then you miss the nuance of a lot of people who want to get rid of that Jew hatred. So I do understand what you mean. I think we should put much more nuance in this discussion in order to get more people to talk about this and to get a much fuller audience here than only activists, because there are a lot of people who are concerned with this, who are not activists and who want to talk about this.
You can react it. I also want to point out that that my panelists, I don't think most of them identify themselves as activists, but yeah.
Okay. Could you wait a second? She wanted to respond first.
I'll keep it very short because I understand. Two things I want to say. That was not completely my point, actually, but I won't try to clarify. What I will just say is that there's an article from the Groene Amsterdammer, and it's called Taal is niet stom. And it was from the beginning of when the language started to change in politics. And I just highly recommend it, and maybe then you'll read it and then think, oh, that's what she's sort of...
Okay, we will do that.
Send it to me.
I had to think about this relletje. What is it in English? A relletje. In Germany in the end of the 70s and in Holland in 87 with this play by Rainer Fassbinder, where there is a character called who is called the rich Jew. Yeah, Velderstad in the Dood. And that a lot of people called it anti-Semitic, which it wasn't, although it used, some terms that, you could call anti-Semitic. And I think also in that, I think it's a reply to what you say. I think it was so not helpful, also not for the Jewish community in the Netherlands, to call that anti-Semitic. We all missed the point, or all those people missed the point that Fassbinder wanted to make, is that if anti-Semitism becomes, the criminal crime, and we are all only focusing on that, what does it do with our society? And don't we, at the end, become anti-Semitic with doing that? So, and I think to come back to my point, which I didn't make that clear, I think, Jelle, your answer to this thing on the Anne Frank house. I think you have to call it Holocaust denial, and then tell about the whole conspiracy theory about. And of course, that in that sense you can call it anti-Semitic, but people call this the most gross form of anti-Semitism that exists. And I think, you know, and that's my. Then what are we doing then? You know, that's I think. But Edda wants to.
That's because it is one of the most gross forms of anti-Semitism. If you deny the Holocaust, then you basically deny the rights of Jews to live in safety. Because if you deny that, and first of all, it hurts somebody. Yeah, the family of somebody has been murdered, and you deny that they're murdered. So it's a direct insult, and it causes pain. But secondly, on a more broader level, if everybody has the right to live in safety, therefore, if a crime is committed against you as a person, you have a right that it's recognized, that there's courts, that there's a system to guard you from that the memory of that crime is preserved so it doesn't happen again. If you then deny that crime, you take away that equal right for Jews. And therefore, in a most basic sense that anti-Semitism is really creating the same safe environment for Jews as it is for non-Jews, you are violating that principle. So that's why this case actually is anti-Semitism, even if you don't go further in explaining the conspiracy theory part of it.
I have to finish up. No? Oh.
I don't.
I think Hadar wanted to add something, but since I was walking with the mic, I didn't see that she sent the message.
Okay. Well, then after Judith, Hadar can.
I want to say something to the two people in the back who talked about language. I think, you know, I'm an historian, right? And I don't tend to make up things and just make general statements. The opposite. I think we've had some people on the screen this evening who have told big stories with a lack of many historical contextualizations. It is not my style. So I try in my talks here not to get too complicated about the history of everything, because I was warned also not to, because the audience has to follow what I say. But I think, you know, if we talk about Christians who are friends of Jews, I would never say that there are no Christians who are not friends of Jews. I have lots of Christian friends who are friends of Jews, who are either also pro-Israel or critical of Israel. That's all possible. But if you look at evangelical Christians and you look at certain groups of Christians who are very pro-Israel, it's very important to look at why they are pro-Israel as a group, not as individuals. So this is my plea on behalf of contextualization, nuance. So it's not, as you say, that I am not nuanced. I think the opposite. I think you're saying there are so many friends of Israel and Christian. I think that's very unnuanced. I think you have to look at what's behind it. So I would like to leave it at that, but I would like to tell you something that happened to me speaking about language. I get a magazine from the Prince Bernhard Fund. And in this magazine of the Prince Bernhard Fund, which I support, there was an article on outsider art. And it was an interview with the people who had made this exhibit of the outsider art in the Hermitage. And on one of the illustrations that was in the magazine, there were clear anti-Semitic stereotypes. And I was so shocked that I couldn't believe it. So I sent an email to the Prince Bernhard Fund. And the person who they let answer me, is their just general lower level PR person from the magazine. And she said, well, you know, we can't be responsible for everything that someone does in an exhibit. So I wrote back, I said, but you give them money, you gave them money for this exhibit, which is why it was in the magazine. Don't you look at what you're supporting, right? I said, these are clear anti-Semitic stereotypes. I said, I can give you pictures from the Middle Ages until today that show the same stereotypes. The answer was, I'm so sorry you feel that way. Right? So if we want to talk about words, you know, and this made me furious. Right? And this made me so furious that I wrote back that I said, I will not tolerate an answer like that, and I find this unacceptable. And I was invited to an event, and they sent me, the highest person was sent to talk to me, because they knew I was in the room. Yeah, and I hope it helped, right? I hope it helped because I found it shocking. And they said they do look at the art that is in an exhibit, but that piece of art, and I hope it's true, was not in the original plan of what they presented. And I hope it's true, right? But they said, well, we in the future we'll look carefully at what we publish in our magazine. I said, no, you have to look carefully at what you're giving money for. Yeah, I said that's more important. I said it just happens I caught it because it was in the magazine, and I really found this very upsetting. And you know what I found most upsetting of all? That this was under the category of outsider art, and I thought, how is it possible that art that's considered outsider was such an insider when it came to anti-Semitism? This was the irony. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can let Hadar say a piece, and then we also have a video to show to close off. That we need to
Yeah, and I also want to make a few remarks then, and then okay, Hadar, welcome back.
Yeah, there's so much that was said that I was going to respond to something in particular, but I feel like there's been so many other things that have been said since then. But I guess I just want to really emphasize and highlight how much trauma and perception play into our understanding of reality and into what is happening politically. And I think some people mentioned that earlier, is that, you know, and I think especially with Israel, it's like there's so much bound trauma that is clouding people's perceptions of seeing what is happening clearly. And I think that, you know, there was someone earlier that was talking about emotions or, you know, language and how that all ties in. I mean, I think that is part of the political conversation because we are human beings, we're emotional beings, our perception is dependent on our personal conditioning and our personal histories. But, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that the reality isn't what it is, you know, and I think that in terms of like extreme language, right, like saying Israel's an apartheid state can feel extreme to some people, depending on how they're thinking or where they're coming from. But also that is what most human rights organizations, both Israeli and European and American organizations, are saying. So, you know, we need to actually contend with that. And I think I'll just kind of close was just sharing that, you know, I think that we also have to re-understand what safety means, because if our safety is bound up in a military occupation of another people, like, is that really the price that we're willing to make? And why is it so radical to actually fight for one democratic state from the river to the sea where everyone has an equal right? And when we're talking about fighting anti-Semitism, and we, you know, earlier we were talking about democracy and equality, why is that so hard to also offer that to Palestinians and to other communities as well? How is that not connected? So I think that, you know, just as Jewish people, just like people, we want people to understand our struggle and our histories of oppression and our, you know, the way that systemic racism is functioning against us. It's like we also need to show up and understand how that's functioning against other communities, and specifically how it is functioning in our name.
Thank you. I think that's no. Now it's no. I have the mic and I'm the moderator, and I really have to close this. No, I have to close. Yeah, but yeah, okay, but then you have to look her up online and go on with conversation because I have to wrap up this program, and I think that what this shows, there are so many. Please, can we give it a little central than me? There are so many more discussions that, you know, we can talk about Israel. We can talk about even, you know, in what way artists are, you know, subsidized artists. You make whatever they want to make with language. But what I really also saw tonight is that a lot of people from the Jewish community do not also agree with each other 100% on this topic, you know, because there is not, of course, one Jewish community. And I think especially when you talk about what is anti-Semitism in the social realm, and I really am happy how you made those differences, and that in the social realm, also within the Jewish community, there's a lot of discussion what anti-Semitism is, you know, and we don't all agree on it. And I mean, that makes it sometimes maybe even more difficult, maybe, to tackle it. So that is, I think, something that also we not only should talk a lot with the other communities, but also really have this conversation within the Jewish community of what we think anti-Semitism is and what we should do against it. And I want to close up with a video which was produced by OIV, and I think it also really shows beautiful that the Jewish community isn't one community, but it consists of many different people. That is the open, inclusive, unapologetically Jewish community. Unapologetically Jewish community, and Jelle Zijlstra and Liefnat Faber are co-founders of it, and they organize a lot of events also, and also this event. And so let's watch the film, and thank you very much for your attention.
I remember I wanted to get it corrected as soon as I turned 18.
Het symboliseert voor mij mijn queerness en punk Jewness.
I was told that I didn't look Jewish enough.
Een goed gevoel heb voor humor en heel zelfverzekerd ben.
My name is Levi and I am 8. My name is Charlie and I am 8.
Some people say a living wonder, while I live you all wonder.
Ja, het object dat ik heb meegenomen is een rasp. Ja, eten is voor mij een hele heldere, duidelijke en fijne manier om in verbinding te zijn met mijn Joodse identiteit.
Ik was denk ik een jaar of 3 of 4. We hebben nog oude tekeningen bij mijn ouders thuis liggen dat ik Davidsterren heb getekend.
Mijn achtergrond is gemengd, het is Frans en Asia Pacific. De eerste keer dat ik me echt bewust was van de Joodse gemeenschap en van mijn Joods zijn is geweest dat toen ik op mijn 6e jaar op een begrafenis lawaai was van een dierbare.
That's like asking a fish when did he first realize that he lived in water. Born and raised in Brooklyn, everybody was Jewish whom I grew up with.
She invited me to go to synagogue, and it was cool, and it felt reconnecting with something that I didn't really know was there, but it was there.
At the age of 7, I saw for the first time an uncircumcised penis.
Een goede vraag eigenlijk, weet ik eigenlijk niet.
What would I say is very Jewish about me is probably my desire to feed people.
So what's really Jewish about me, I would say it's my nose. It is sort of like the undervalued asset. Nowadays, it's probably the sweetest part of being a Jew. It's this sweet ride right here.
In one word, what's most Jewish about me is rachmanos, which means compassion. And I think this is the most important thing we Jews offer the world.
Ik zat gisteren nog in de trein met een collega en die zei... Oh, ik wist helemaal niet dat er nog Joden waren in Nederland. Ik dacht dat die allemaal weg waren na de Tweede Wereldoorlog.
Still don't like the idea of putting my Magen David in my shirt when I'm out on the street.
Jood zijn in Nederland vind ik op sommige momenten best wel eng en ook wel gevaarlijk.
Het hangt er vanaf eigenlijk, maar het kan leuk zijn. Het kan ook dreigend zijn voor mezelf, in mijn ervaring.
I have never encountered so much anti-Semitism in any place I lived as here. The way people just express their anti-Semitic opinions has shocked me.
Do you feel Jewish?
Yeah.
And what does it feel like?
It feels fun and it feels trash.
Het object dat ik heb meegenomen is eigenlijk is mijn ring, eigenlijk, die van mijn oma. Dat is het laatste wat ik nog van haar heb. Het doet me gewoon denken aan, laat ik zeggen, de Surinaamse kant en het Joods, waar het ook vandaan komt.
Als ik aan Jodendom denk, denk ik meteen aan eten. En er is altijd eten over en ik moet altijd eten mee naar huis nemen. En dat gaat dan in aluminiumfolie.
This is a kiddush cup that was my grandmother's. My grandparents escaped the pogroms This is one of the few things I have from my grandparents.
This is a very small thing, but it really reminds me much more of kind of the actual human history of Jewishness.
Overal waar ik kom heb ik een mezuzah hangen in een huis of mijn werk, op het stadhuis, maar wel altijd één die niet conventioneel is.
A Sephardic amulet. It was given to me by my dad, and he told me, you can have this when you become grown and you can handle the responsibility of something so powerful.
When we look at objects, they usually tend to hold larger stories, and I think that especially the little things are what makes being Jewish so different for every single person.
Koop het nu!
Okay, hang on, but we can get it out in a minute.
Right.
I meant that in a non-sexual way. Okay.
Oh, I'm disappointed in you.
My parents, with everything I tell them I accomplished in life.
We've got something in the can, yes.
Okay.